I know from my own experience that a cancer diagnosis can feel overwhelming. Yet, I also know that early detection...
At 3:47 this morning, King Charles III's heart monitor flatlined and doctors had seconds to save Britain's monarch from death. Prince William raced through pre-dawn London to find his father unconscious on life support, and so close to death that the medical team had already prepared the succession protocols. The palace announced a medical complication hours ago, but the truth leaking from inside St. Mary's Hospital is far more terrifying. The king's organs are failing, his body is destroying itself, and Britain may have a new king before the sun rises tomorrow. The crisis begins. The night shift at Clarence House had settled into its familiar rhythm, security personnel making their rounds through dimly lit corridors while the king slept in his private quarters on the second floor. Nurse Rebecca Thornton, a veteran of 23 years caring for high-profile patients, sat at her monitoring station reviewing the overnight vital signs data streaming from sensors connected to Charles's body. She had been assigned to the king's personal medical team 6 months earlier when his cancer diagnosis became known to the tight circle of palace insiders who needed to know, and she had grown accustomed to the patterns of his overnight readings, the predictable fluctuations that came with his treatment regimen and his body's natural rhythms. But at 3:32 this morning, something changed. The monitors registered a sudden drop in blood oxygen levels, a spike in heart rate, and irregularities in cardiac rhythm that immediately triggered alarms on Rebecca's console. She was moving before the alarms finished their first cycle, racing down the corridor toward the king's bedroom while simultaneously activating the emergency protocol that would summon the full medical team and notify the royal protection officers that something was critically wrong. Rebecca found Charles sitting upright in bed, his face pale and covered in perspiration, his breathing labored and shallow. He was conscious but clearly in severe distress, one hand clutched to his chest while the other gripped the bedside table as if anchoring himself against waves of pain or disorientation. Years of training took over as Rebecca began her rapid assessment, checking pulse and breathing while firing questions designed to determine the nature and severity of what was happening. Charles tried to respond, but his words came in fragments, his usual articulate precision replaced by confused attempts to explain sensations he clearly did not fully understand himself. Within minutes, the room filled with medical personnel. Dr. Michael Patterson, the king's lead oncologist, arrived still pulling on his jacket over pajamas, his face grave as he processed the information Rebecca rapidly relayed. Dr. Sarah Chen, the cardiologist who had been monitoring Charles's heart function throughout his cancer treatment, was right behind him, already ordering tests and interventions based on the vital signs displayed on portable monitors that staff had wheeled into the bedroom. The palace physician, Dr. James Whitmore, coordinated the response while simultaneously notifying the king's private secretary that a significant medical event was in progress and that protocols for such emergencies needed to be activated. The initial assessment suggested multiple systems in crisis simultaneously. Charles's blood pressure had dropped dangerously low while his heart struggled to maintain adequate rhythm and output. His breathing was compromised, with oxygen saturation levels hovering at the edge of what could sustain consciousness and organ function. Blood tests rushed to the small laboratory maintained within Clarence House for exactly these situations would take precious minutes to process. But the clinical picture already suggested something catastrophic was happening, something that went beyond the expected side effects of cancer treatment or the predictable complications of his known condition. Dr. Patterson made the call that everyone had hoped would never be necessary. He ordered immediate transfer to a hospital, overruling the usual palace preference for handling medical matters as privately as possible within royal residences. The king's condition was too unstable, too unpredictable, too severe to manage with the resources available, even in the well-equipped medical suite that had been established at Clarence House. Charles needed the full capabilities of a major hospital, access to specialists and equipment that could respond to whatever was causing this sudden deterioration. The logistics of moving a sitting monarch in a medical crisis were complex and had been planned for but never executed. Security protocols required coordination with Metropolitan Police protection units and with the hospital receiving the patient. Media management demanded absolute control over information flow to prevent premature or inaccurate reporting that could trigger public panic or constitutional uncertainty. The line of succession required notification of the heir apparent so that Prince William could be prepared to assume responsibilities if his father's condition prevented Charles from fulfilling his constitutional duties. At 3:51 this morning, Prince William's phone rang with the specific tone designated for emergency royal communications. He answered immediately, years of preparation for such moments overriding the grogginess of being awakened from deep sleep. The King's private secretary, Sir Edward Hamilton, delivered the news with professional calm that nonetheless could not entirely mask the underlying urgency. The King had suffered a serious medical event, was being transferred to hospital, and William's presence was requested immediately. The careful language left room for hope, but the very fact of the call at such an hour communicated that the situation was genuinely grave. William dressed quickly and quietly, trying not to wake Catherine, but knowing she would sense his absence and worry. He left a brief note explaining that his father had taken ill and that he had been called to the hospital, promising to update her as soon as he knew more. The drive through empty pre-dawn London streets was surreal, his protection officers maintaining radio silence about their destination while William's mind raced through possibilities and implications, medical scenarios and constitutional consequences, personal fears and institutional responsibilities, all colliding in his thoughts. He arrived at the private entrance of St. Mary's Hospital to find organized chaos, medical staff preparing trauma rooms while hospital administrators coordinated with palace officials about security arrangements and communication protocols. Sir Edward met William at the entrance, his face showing the strain of the past hour. Charles had arrived 15 minutes earlier and was already undergoing emergency diagnostics and treatment. The medical team had stabilized his immediate crisis, but the underlying cause remained unclear, and his condition remained critical. William was escorted to a private waiting area where he could be immediately accessible if his father's condition changed or if decisions needed to be made about treatment options. Dr. Patterson joined him within minutes, explaining what they knew and what remained mysterious about the King's sudden deterioration. The cancer itself did not appear to be the direct cause of the crisis, though it certainly complicated the medical picture and limited treatment options. Instead, something else had triggered catastrophic system failures, and until they understood what that something was, they could not predict whether Charles would stabilize, continue declining, or face additional crises in the hours ahead. The diagnosis. The hours between 4 and 8 this morning passed in agonizing slow motion, marked by periodic updates from medical teams working frantically to understand what was happening inside the King's body. Advanced imaging revealed complications that explained some symptoms but raised new questions about underlying causes. Blood work showed markers that suggested multiple organ systems were under severe stress. Specialists were consulted via secure video links, experts in oncology and cardiology and infectious disease all reviewing data and debating possibilities. By 6:30 this morning, a picture was beginning to emerge, and it was more frightening than anyone had initially feared. Charles was experiencing what doctors termed a cytokine storm, a catastrophic immune system overreaction that was attacking his body's own tissues and organs. This type of crisis could be triggered by various factors including infections, certain cancer treatments, or spontaneous immune system dysfunction in patients whose systems were already compromised by illness and therapy. The storm had initially focused on his cardiovascular system, explaining the cardiac symptoms that had first alerted medical staff, but it was now spreading to affect his lungs, kidneys, and liver. Dr. Patterson explained to William that cytokine storms were extremely dangerous and notoriously difficult to control. The immune system, which normally defended the body against threats, had become the threat itself, launching attacks that could cause irreversible organ damage or complete system failure. Treatment required suppressing the immune response without leaving the patient vulnerable to infections, a delicate balancing act made even more precarious by Charles's underlying cancer and his already weakened condition from months of treatment. The medical team had begun aggressive interventions, including powerful immunosuppressive drugs, supportive care for failing organs, and close monitoring for any signs of additional complications. Charles remained sedated to reduce the physical stress on his systems and to allow the treatments to work without interference from his body's natural responses. He was on a ventilator helping his lungs function, on medications supporting his blood pressure and heart rhythm, and connected to dialysis equipment assisting his struggling kidneys. William sat with his father for a time this morning, looking at the man who had always seemed larger than life, now reduced to a frighteningly fragile figure, surrounded by machines and monitors. Charles's face was peaceful in sedation but pale, his breathing entirely controlled by the ventilator, his body completely dependent on technology and medical expertise for survival. It was impossible to reconcile this image with the vital, engaged man who just yesterday had been conducting meetings and fulfilling royal duties with his usual energy and attention to detail. By 8 o'clock this morning, the palace could no longer maintain complete silence about the situation. Too many people knew something significant had happened. Too many hospital staff and emergency personnel had been involved. Too many security measures had been implemented. A brief statement was prepared acknowledging that the king had been admitted to hospital overnight for treatment of complications related to his ongoing medical care, that he was receiving excellent attention from medical specialists, and that further updates would be provided as appropriate. The statement was carefully crafted to provide minimal information while preventing wild speculation, though it could not entirely stop the rumor mill from churning. The announcement earlier this morning broke across broadcasts and social media, triggering immediate global attention and concern. Royal correspondents descended on St. Mary's Hospital, establishing positions outside the security perimeter where they could broadcast updates and speculate about implications. Government officials were briefed on the situation and began reviewing protocols for various scenarios depending on how the king's condition evolved. Commonwealth nations were notified through diplomatic channels that the monarch's health had taken a concerning turn and that they should be prepared for potential developments. Inside the hospital, medical teams continue their battle to stabilize Charles's condition and reverse the cytokine storm before it causes irreversible damage. The king's age, his underlying cancer, and the months of treatment that had already weakened his body all work against him, reducing his resilience and his capacity to withstand the assault his immune system is launching. Every hour without significant improvement decreases the likelihood of full recovery and increases the probability that even if Charles survives this immediate crisis, he will emerge profoundly weakened and potentially unable to resume his full responsibilities. Prince William finds himself thrust into a role he had always known would eventually be his, but had hoped would not arrive for many years yet. Palace officials began briefing him this morning on constitutional procedures and governmental responsibilities that might need to be temporarily transferred if Charles remains incapacitated. The Regency Act provides mechanisms for the heir to assume royal duties if the monarch is unable to perform them, but implementing such measures requires formal declarations and parliamentary involvement that no one wants to pursue unless absolutely necessary. Catherine arrived at the hospital mid-morning, having been updated by William and having arranged care for their children so she could provide support during what is clearly an extended crisis. Her presence steadies William, giving him someone with whom he can be completely honest about his fears and uncertainties without needing to maintain the stoic public face that royal protocol demands. Together they wait, receiving periodic updates from medical teams, making necessary decisions about family notifications and public communications, and trying to prepare themselves emotionally for whatever outcome the next hours or days might bring. The palace in crisis. While doctors fight to save the king's life, palace officials confront the reality that the monarchy itself is in a moment of profound vulnerability and uncertainty. Sir Edward Hamilton convenes emergency meetings with senior courtiers, constitutional experts, and government liaisons to review scenarios and ensure that appropriate preparations are in place for various possible outcomes. These are conversations that had been theoretically planned for but never actually implemented, Discussions about what happens when a monarch's reign might end suddenly, rather than with the gradual decline that allows for orderly transition. The immediate constitutional questions focus on whether Charles will be able to resume his duties, and if not, how quickly regency arrangements need to be formalized. The law is clear about procedures, but implementation requires careful coordination between palace, parliament, and government to ensure continuity of constitutional functions while respecting both the king's dignity and the public's need for stable governance. Every decision has to balance legal requirements against human considerations, institutional needs against family privacy. Queen Camilla arrived at the hospital late this morning, her face drawn with worry and exhaustion. She had been at Highgrove when the crisis began and had immediately arranged transport to London, arriving to find her husband sedated and surrounded by life support machinery. Her relationship with Charles has survived many storms over the decades, has endured public condemnation and private difficulties, has finally achieved acceptance and even affection from many Britons who had initially rejected her. Now she faces the possibility of losing him just as they have reached a place of relative peace and stability in their long journey together. The medical updates through the afternoon offer mixed signals. Some of Charles's vital signs have stabilized, suggesting the treatments are beginning to control the cytokine storm's worst effects. But other indicators remain troubling, particularly markers of organ function that show his kidneys and liver are struggling despite supportive interventions. The cancer itself, which had been in a relatively stable phase before this crisis, remains a concern and could complicate recovery even if the immediate emergency is resolved. Dr. Patterson is honest with the family about prognosis and possibilities. Best case scenario, Charles will stabilize over the next 24 to 48 hours. The cytokine storm will be brought under control, and he will begin a slow recovery that will nonetheless leave him significantly weakened for an extended period. He might eventually resume some royal duties, but will likely never regain the energy and capacity he possessed before this crisis. Worst-case scenario, organ damage will prove irreversible, additional complications will emerge, and despite medical intervention, Charles will not survive the week. The palace statement released at 2 o'clock this afternoon acknowledges that the king's condition is serious and that he will remain hospitalized for the foreseeable future. It thanks the public for their concern and requests privacy for the royal family during this difficult time. The statement is necessarily vague, but its tone communicates genuine worry, moving beyond the routine reassurances that typically accompany royal health bulletins. Royal correspondents correctly interpret the language as indicating that Charles's situation is more grave than initial reports had suggested. Public reaction has been immediate and emotional. Despite whatever criticisms might be leveled at the monarchy as an institution or at individual royals, Charles himself has earned substantial goodwill through decades of dedication to charitable causes, environmental advocacy, and authentic engagement with issues that matter to ordinary Britons. The prospect of losing him so soon after he finally ascended to the throne he waited his entire life to occupy strikes many as profoundly unfair and tragic. Tributes and well-wishes flood social media. Crowds gather outside Buckingham Palace to leave flowers and messages of support, and religious leaders of various faiths offer prayers for the king's recovery. Inside the hospital, William struggles with the dual burden of personal grief and institutional responsibility. As a son, he desperately wants his father to survive and recover, and wants more time to build the relationship that has sometimes been strained by the demands of royal life and by the complications of Charles's complicated personal history. As heir apparent, he understands that he needs to prepare for the possibility of sudden succession, needs to be ready to assume the throne and all its responsibilities if his father does not survive this crisis or emerges too weakened to continue reigning. Catherine provides quiet support, managing family logistics and shielding their children from the full weight of what is happening while ensuring they understand that their grandfather is very ill and that the family needs to rally together. She coordinates with other family members, ensuring that everyone who should be informed has current information and that no one feels excluded or forgotten during the crisis. Her organizational skills and emotional intelligence, honed over 20 years of royal life, prove invaluable during these chaotic and emotionally charged hours. Prince Harry, who had been in California when the crisis began, caught the first available flight to London upon being notified of his father's condition. Whatever rifts have developed between Harry and the rest of the family, whatever grievances or resentments linger from past conflicts, the possibility of losing Charles overrides everything else. He arrives at the hospital late this afternoon, greeted by William with an embrace that communicates that in this moment, family bonds trump all previous disagreements. Together, they sit with their father, two sons watching machines breathe for a man who has always seemed invincible despite his very human flaws and vulnerabilities. The turning point. As evening falls over London this Saturday, a new development threatens to tip Charles's precarious stability into complete crisis. His temperature spikes dramatically despite medications, suggesting a new infection has taken hold in his immunosuppressed and weakened body. Medical teams scramble to identify the source, running cultures and starting broad-spectrum antibiotics while monitoring for signs of septic shock that could prove rapidly fatal in his compromised state. Dr. Chen gathers the family in a private conference room to explain the gravity of this new development. Charles's body is fighting battles on multiple fronts simultaneously: the cytokine storm, the underlying cancer, the organ damage from both the storm and his previous treatments, and now a potentially deadly infection. His reserves are exhausted, his systems stretched to their absolute limits. The next 12 to 24 hours will likely determine whether he will survive at all, let alone with what level of function and capacity. William asks the question everyone is thinking, but no one wants to voice. Should they prepare for the worst? Dr. Chen answers with characteristic honesty. Yes, they should prepare themselves emotionally for the possibility that Charles might not survive this crisis. But they should also know that the medical team will continue fighting with every resource and intervention available, that stranger recoveries have occurred, and that Charles himself is a fighter who has survived many challenges throughout his life. The palace prepares draft statements for various scenarios, morbid but necessary work that ensures appropriate communications can be released quickly, regardless of how events unfold. Government officials are briefed on succession protocols and constitutional procedures. Security arrangements are reviewed and strengthened to manage the potential public response to a royal death or succession. Everything is positioned to respond efficiently and appropriately to whatever the next hours might bring. At 11:30 tonight, as medical staff perform another round of assessments and interventions, Charles's condition begins to shift in ways that initially alarm everyone present. His blood pressure fluctuates wildly, his heart rhythm becomes erratic, and monitors register changes that suggest possible cardiac arrest. The medical team prepares for the worst, readying equipment and medications for emergency resuscitation, while Dr. Patterson maintains position at Charles's bedside, ready to make split-second decisions about interventions. But then, unexpectedly, the wild fluctuations begin to settle. Charles's blood pressure stabilizes at levels that, while still concerning, are no longer immediately life-threatening. His heart rhythm, though irregular, finds a pattern that his compromised cardiovascular system can apparently sustain. His oxygen levels improve slightly as his lungs begin responding better to ventilator support. It is not recovery, not remotely close to being out of danger, but it is stabilization after hours of deterioration. Dr. Patterson allows himself cautious optimism for the first time since the crisis began. The next several hours will tell them whether this stabilization will hold, or whether it is merely a temporary reprieve before final decline. But the fact that Charles's body has found some equilibrium, that his systems have stopped their catastrophic spiral, suggests that perhaps the worst of the cytokine storm has passed and that the treatments are beginning to gain the upper hand. William and Harry remain at the hospital through the night, dozing in chairs when exhaustion overwhelms them, but mostly staying alert and ready to respond to any change in their father's condition. Camilla alternates between sitting with Charles and retreating to a private room to rest and compose herself before returning to the bedside vigil. Catherine manages logistics from Kensington Palace, coordinating with staff about the children's schedules and needs while staying in constant communication with William about developments at the hospital. Holding on. As midnight approaches, the medical team continues its exhausting battle to keep Charles alive and to reverse the damage the cytokine storm has inflicted on his body. Every hour that passes without catastrophic decline is a small victory, every stabilized vital sign a reason for cautious hope. But the underlying reality remains terrifying. The king is critically ill, dependent on multiple life support systems, and facing a recovery timeline that will be measured in months if he survives at all. Dr. Patterson briefs the family on what the coming hours and days will look like if Charles continues to stabilize. They will attempt to wean him from the ventilator sometime in the next 48 hours, testing whether his lungs can function independently. They will gradually reduce medication support for his heart and blood pressure, assessing whether his cardiovascular system can sustain adequate function without pharmaceutical assistance. They will monitor his kidney and liver function closely, watching for signs of recovery or for indications that damage may be permanent. Each of these steps carries significant risk. Removing support too quickly could trigger new crises, but leaving Charles dependent on machines indefinitely creates its own dangers, including infections, muscle atrophy, and complications from prolonged immobility and sedation. The medical team must walk an impossible tightrope, balancing competing risks while recognizing that there are no perfect choices, only difficult decisions with uncertain outcomes. William steps outside briefly to call his children, speaking with George, Charlotte, and Louis in age-appropriate ways about their grandfather's illness. He reassures them that excellent doctors are caring for Grandpa, that the family is together supporting each other, and that everyone hopes very much that he will get better. He does not tell them how grave the situation truly is, how close they came today to losing their grandfather, how uncertain the future remains. That burden is his to carry, not theirs. Inside the hospital room, Camilla sits beside Charles's bed, her hand resting gently on his arm, speaking to him in quiet tones even though he remains deeply sedated. She tells him about the children's concerns, about William's steadiness in crisis, about Harry's immediate return from California. She tells him about the crowds gathering outside Buckingham Palace, about the prayers being offered in churches across the Commonwealth, about how much the nation needs him to fight and survive. Whether he can hear her words or process their meaning, no one knows, but speaking them brings her comfort and perhaps, medical staff suggest, might reach him on some level beyond conscious awareness. The night wears on with agonizing slowness. Monitors beep steadily, charting every heartbeat and breath. Nurses move quietly through the room, checking equipment and recording data. Doctors consult in hushed tones outside the door, reviewing test results and adjusting treatment protocols. And through it all, Charles remains suspended between life and death, his body fighting battles on multiple fronts, while his family watches and waits and prays for outcomes they cannot control. Prince Harry finds himself reflecting on regrets and missed opportunities, conversations left unfinished and wounds left unhealed. The possibility of losing his father before reconciliation can be achieved weighs heavily, forcing him to confront how much of the distance between them has been his own choice and how much he wishes he could undo. He thinks about his children, about Archie and Lilibet who barely know their grandfather, about the relationship they might never have the chance to build if Charles does not survive. As the first hours of Sunday morning begin to unfold, the medical team observes with cautious relief that Charles's stabilization is holding. His vital signs remain concerning but have stopped the wild fluctuations that characterized the earlier crisis. His organ function markers show no further deterioration, and perhaps the tiniest hints of improvement. The infection that sparked fears of septic shock appears to be responding to antibiotics, though it will take days to confirm that the threat has truly passed. The vigil continues. Sunday morning arrives with Britain waking to a nation in suspense, millions checking their phones and televisions for updates on the king's condition. The palace has maintained careful silence through the night, neither confirming improvement nor acknowledging additional crises, leaving the public to parse every subtle signal and interpret every minor change in official language or security protocols around the hospital. Religious services across the country include prayers for Charles's recovery, with packed congregations demonstrating the depth of public concern and the genuine affection many Britons feel for their monarch despite whatever criticisms they might level at the institution. The Archbishop of Canterbury speaks movingly about the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing those we love while we have them, his words resonating with a nation confronting the possibility of losing the king who has only recently ascended to the throne. Inside St. Mary's Hospital, Dr. Patterson makes the decision that the time has come to begin attempting to wake Charles from sedation. The king has been unconscious since shortly after his arrival nearly 30 hours ago, his body given complete rest while medications and interventions fought to stabilize his failing systems. But keeping him sedated indefinitely is not viable, and the medical team needs to assess his neurological function and his capacity to participate in his own recovery. The process of reducing sedation is gradual and carefully monitored, with doctors ready to immediately increase medications again if Charles shows signs of distress or if his vital signs destabilize under the stress of consciousness. Over the course of several hours, they titrate down the drugs keeping him unconscious, watching for signs of awareness and response while maintaining enough support to prevent panic or pain. By early afternoon, Charles begins to show signs of emerging consciousness. His eyes flutter open briefly before closing again. His fingers twitch in response to Camilla's hand holding his. His breathing pattern changes subtly as his brain begins reasserting some control over functions that have been entirely mechanical. Each small sign is closely observed and documented, pieces of evidence that will help the medical team understand how much function remains and what challenges the recovery ahead might hold. When Charles's eyes finally open and stay open, confusion and fear are evident in his expression. He tries to speak, but the ventilator tube prevents it, creating panic that sends his vital signs spiking and forces medical staff to quickly intervene with reassurance and explanation. William leans close, speaking calmly and clearly, explaining where Charles is and what has happened, trying to provide orientation and comfort while medical staff work to stabilize his distress. The decision is made to remove the ventilator, a moment of profound tension as the breathing tube is extracted and Charles's lungs are left to function independently for the first time in more than a day. For several terrifying seconds, his breathing is shallow and inadequate, oxygen levels beginning to drop in ways that suggest they may need to immediately re-intubate. But then his body finds its rhythm, his lungs remember their work, and his oxygen saturation begins to climb back toward acceptable levels. Charles's first words are barely audible, his voice ravaged by the ventilator and by the trauma his body has endured. He asks what happened, how long he has been here, whether he is dying. William and Camilla take turns answering, their voices breaking with emotion as they explain the crisis, reassure him that he is receiving excellent care, and express their profound relief that he is conscious and able to speak. The family's joy at Charles regaining consciousness is tempered by the medical team's sober assessment of the road ahead. The king remains critically ill despite being awake. His organ function is still compromised, his body profoundly weakened, his capacity for recovery uncertain. He will need weeks minimum in hospital, months of rehabilitation, and possibly permanent limitations on his ability to fulfill the demanding responsibilities of monarchy. As Sunday evening approaches, the palace prepares a statement for release acknowledging that the king has regained consciousness and is communicating with family and medical staff. The statement expresses cautious optimism while emphasizing that Charles remains seriously ill and that recovery will be a lengthy process. It thanks the public again for their overwhelming support and requests continued privacy and prayers as the king begins the difficult journey back to health. The monitors beep steadily as King Charles fights for every breath, but the doctors know what the palace won't say, even if he survives the night. The vigorous monarch who ruled yesterday is gone forever. In the shadows of the hospital room, Prince William sits watching his father cling to life, understanding with cold certainty that whether Charles lives or dies, the crown is already shifting to younger shoulders. Britain sleeps uneasily this Saturday night, unaware that the careful announcement made this morning wasn't really news at all. It was the beginning of the end. And by tomorrow, everything may have already changed.